This is a loosely coupled show with James Hickey and Comartin. If you're new to this channel, we chat about software architecture and design. Make sure to subscribe to get all our latest episodes. Okay, so events everywhere was kind of this topic you brought up. Maybe you can lead it off of where you're going with this, because I think we're on the same page about, I posted something on Twitter maybe a week ago where I was reading an article on like Medium or Dev2 or whatever, and the word event was used, and I understood the context and what they were using it. However, it was used subsequently later on in the article, kind of like in a one-off, and they were referring to something completely different.
Yeah.
So I tweeted kind of saying, well, event is kind of like this overloaded term now where...
Like service.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Well, yeah, in a way, yes. But in a way of like, it's ambiguous a little bit because there's different ways to be talking about it, I guess. Or even in the vein of how you're using events in your system and what those type of events are.
Yeah.
Like there's distinctions, I guess. So I don't know if that's where you were going with it.
Pretty much, like my thought was, like for example, right, you have like domain events. But then when you're talking about domain events, you could be talking about like, I am going to produce an event in my code, or you could be doing like event storming where you're talking to business experts or business people about domain events. So like even that specific term, like then there's like integration events, and with event sourcing, there's like, I guess you would maybe technically still call those domain events, but they probably wouldn't be the same kind of domain events that you would have if you weren't doing event sourcing. So like even there's a distinction. And then there's like even just domain events, there's the distinction between I'm talking to a business person about domain events, as opposed to, again, in my code, at the implementation of my domain event. And now we're talking about, okay, are you publishing a domain event in process or out of process? And then, okay, then it's like, well, now you get into asynchronous messaging. Is an event a message? Is a message an event? Is an event a message? Then you kind of get into that more nitty-gritty. And again, like messaging too is kind of might fall into maybe the same kind of distinctions where I could be messaging synchronously in process, if you kind of want to use the terms like that kind of, if you're sending, like design-wise, you're sending commands to another thing in your system, you might consider that a message of kinds. If you're if you're using an actor model, then it kind of sending messages to actors, right? So yeah, I think it's like you said, yeah, you kind of, when you're talking about event or message, it could mean so many different things. And definitely, I think for people who are getting started, like who are just trying to get up to speed and maybe learning, let's say GDD, and you're learning about domain events, and then you hear about event sourcing somewhere, so you're like, oh, okay, but they're not really the same things. And then
yeah, I could see how this could be very difficult.
Yeah.
I wasn't thinking of it in that way of like, if you're just getting involved in this and like an event's not an event, like what do you mean by event?
Well, even if you are experienced, it's like you said, like you're reading an article about events, and you can kind of say event, and it can just in a different context mean a totally different thing, and it would be easy to kind of misunderstand what someone's saying. Like you hear, like I think you did YouTube thing about having thin messages.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's so many, like off the top of my head, in these, like whether you had like a thin event or a fat event, still an event that you really, when you say that, are talking about for integration, generally.
Yeah.
So I think of, yeah, like integration events, but then you have things like when you talk about like domain events, it depends where you're using that domain event. Like, is it something internal to the context that you're in, like the boundary that you're within? Because you generally will expose something different for like a contract reasons and versioning reasons of like an external event that may map to an internal event. So you have those different types of events because one's for integration to outside systems, right? And then you start talking about when you said like I never even think about that. Like in the event sourcing sense, you're thinking about domain events that represent for sure state transitions in your system. But like if you were talking about domain events not doing event sourcing, that doesn't mean that every one of the domain events that represent a state transition you omit.
Exactly. Yeah.
But and that's the same thing. If you're using event sourcing, it doesn't mean because those are internal, you may not omit all of them to the outside world anyways. It's just used for your own, record of history.
Yeah.
Of where, like, what the progression is of how you got where you are. So yeah, it's confusing as hell. And then on top of that, I mentioned this with when we were talking with Andrew Locke about Kafka and RabbitMQ and stuff. And I also I don't know who I picked this up on and what the actual term was this idea of event carried state transfer, which seemingly is a thing that I think most people are actually doing, versus, say, thinking about thin events or fat events. Well, they are fat events. But even in that blog post video I did, when I was talking about fat events, I was generally talking about like deltas and like what do you want to include in an event rather than just the entire thing it relates to. And just not even caring about deltas, just saying this is the representation of what this thing is now after we've done something to it, which is completely different.
I can see people doing that, like who are just getting started, for example. Even with like domain events, thinking like, okay, I'm going to publish, whatever event, and then just include like the whole aggregate in the event. Like, here's what happened, like, or here's the state of where I'm at right now, and then it comes back to what you were saying, like, well, if somebody else needs that information, there's probably an issue somewhere else, right? Like a design issue.
Yeah, it's kind of odd or ironic you're saying this, because I was just talking about this morning, that kind of same idea, which is, and even this goes back to the thin fat events. And let's say you're trying to do like delta events, not like a full blob of crap, but just what actually pertains to the change, and why that becomes difficult. Oftentimes, I feel like you're in a situation where you're trying to solve a problem that shouldn't even be a problem to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what my original YouTube video was and blog post was about, which was it just like something else is off here, where you're trying to even go into this place of like, well, I don't want to have this thin event that doesn't describe everything, so that the consumer of that event has to then synchronously call back to the producer, right, to get the rest of the information that it needs.
Yeah.
But then how do you know what consumers need to include in that event? And then, because then if you're aware of what they need, then you start polluting this thing, and you're aware of what they need.
Yeah.
Right? But then the reality of it is, or in some situations, is that that's like a non-issue. It's the fact that the consumer should already have the information, or they should be the owner of the information that they're trying to get from, the producer.
Yeah.
It's just like boundaries are not aligned correctly, and that's where you get into that place. But it's hard sometimes to see, like you're trying to solve a problem that shouldn't really even exist.
Yeah. I suspect that probably happens a lot with microservices, right? Just you ad hoc have a micro, and this, I guess, kind of goes, maybe that talk, we might talk about it in a
Yeah, we for
couple weeks
sure
or
will.
whatever.
Yeah.
But um, I mean, in that talk, for example, this is what is it, 1,500 microservices. So some guys from the Monzo Bank, and like just one little part from there is they, for example, they said they have a service, they have a microservice, and that entire microservice just produces goods, basically. Like the whole job of this service is to produce IDs, and that's all it does. And I mean that, yeah, I mean that's, we can talk about that some other time. But I can see where like how small do boundaries get in that case, and like how big or how small should they be? And if like that is a technical thing, that is not a business oriented boundary, right? That is definitely like all about the technology and the implementation of how you're doing things. Now, if all that service is doing is IDs, okay, but now like every other microservice has to call that service
Yeah, you're gonna have
through
a hard dependency on it.
RPC, I
Yeah.
guess. Exactly. So, I mean, obviously it works for them, and it makes sense. Like, I'm not saying like you never want to have like a technical boundary. I think it makes sense for like authentication, for example. But I think that gets a little closer to like a business boundary too. Like, how do you authenticate a person, or when should they be authenticated, or whatever. But it definitely has that technical aspect to it, and that's something that you don't want to reinvent for every part of your system. You want one way to do authentication. But then, yeah, it's like, well, if I need to keep passing information to somebody else, like there's probably an issue there. Like, for example, if I'm an authentication service and like maybe you have like a request and there's like 5 different, I don't know what call them services or whatever, 5 different actors or whatever systems that need to check, well, is this user authenticated? You're probably not going to want to make all of those call the authentication service like at each step, right? You're going to probably use a token of some kind and just say, here's the token, and just pass it down the line, and that way they don't need to call out again or whatever. Or I don't know, you have an API gateway and you just assume it's authenticated and you don't have to even worry about it. Maybe that would be a better approach, right? But it's the same thing, right? You don't want to have these services like calling that other authentication service like individually over and over and having to get that information. I think that's definitely a sign that something is
Yeah, just the
probably not
chattiness,
right there.
the chattiness of
Yeah.
it. Yeah. Yeah, I think the event thing is hard because yeah, I think it's just we're always kind of dancing around the same real core root of
Really?
stuff is its boundaries,
It is, yeah.
right? It's how do you want to communicate between boundaries, and then yeah, what does that look like? What does the flow look like? How do you want to do it? Like we said, okay, sure, yeah, you're using events, but what do you mean by events? Right? Like, what
Yeah.
exactly do you mean by events?
Yeah, and like we talked with Andrew about Kafka, and it's like those are events too.
Yeah, but like it was interesting, right, with some of what he was talking about, and then using I can't remember what it's called. Like, was it like a condensed? I can't remember what the term was. Compacted,
Yeah.
which is just the current state, and it's like, and then he kind of made the comment of like, well, what's the difference between that and just a regular database at that point? I guess it's because you can use it for both, and you
Yeah.
can leverage kind of that log plus that at the same time. Um, yeah, I don't know enough about it to even make sense of how exactly you'd use it. I just know that the conversation was interesting to think about some of the partitioning that I'd be curious of diving a little bit more into, but I get the suspicion that yeah, with something like Kafka, it's for integration events, between systems.
Yeah,
That would be
that's it.
the primary purpose.
That's just it. Like, yeah, it gets pretty complex and nuanced because it's like, well, again, like somebody coming in and being like, "Oh, Kafka," and it's an event bus, or like just calling it that, right? It's like, oh, it's an event log. And I put events on it, and I can consume those events. So I'm going to, yeah. Then it's just another like way to like simply just send events to this other system, and somebody gets them. But like you said, like, well, there's specific kinds of events you probably want to use it for. Um, and then yeah, I mean, if we want to talk about Kafka, then get into like, should you use it for event sourcing or not, and all those kinds of discussions. But yeah, it's the whole like events everywhere. I think it's just, yeah, it's not so simple, I guess. There are a lot of different kinds of events, and it's I don't want to say it's a loaded term, but there are a lot of like variations. I guess it's because event is just it's just a general term, right? It's like event.
Yeah,
Well,
I think it'd be interesting. We should, maybe I'll do that after this, is reach out to somebody from Async API, which is really the way to kind of define all this stuff. And because we're making it like sound, which I obviously I'm saying it, so I agree with it, is, or right now I agree with it, is that there's nuance to this whole thing and how you're talking about it. So I'd be curious to get somebody that's really involved with Async API if we can get them on here and maybe round about this discussion. But I remember a few years ago, Martin Fowler had a blog post, or whatever he calls those things. I think it was titled something along like event driven, something about being like event driven, and kind of exactly that what we're describing right now, maybe in a little bit of a different way, which was, okay, you say your system's event driven. What the heck does that even mean?
yeah,
Right? Because there's just different things that you could be talking about. Like if you're event sourcing, doesn't mean you're event driven. Doesn't mean you're communicating, integrating with outside systems via events. Like that's just how you are internally recording state, or those transitions, kind of that book of record. But yeah, and then if you're doing event state, or event carried state transfer, it's like, well, that's not that it's different. It's a way of communicating, integrating, but it's very different than if you have like thin events.
mm-hmm.
Right? Because the point of you doing that is so that you're not calling back to the producers from the consumers. And that's the reason why you're basically throwing blobs out there. And there's benefits to that, clearly, so because you don't have to make those calls back. But then you have the issue of dealing with, now you have that recorded state somewhere else. And that's not like necessarily a problem. It's just something else you got to deal with.
Yeah. And so, I can imagine some kind of like data warehousing, or even like a ETL, or some kind of like data warehousing scenario, right, where you want to call it an event.
Yeah, I guess moral of the story for me is that I think what I need to do is, when I'm talking about them being a little bit more descriptive, because even in that blog post that I said about like fat events, thin events, I didn't use I know I used the word integration, but I didn't use it enough, right? Because that's really what I was talking about, I was talking about integration events. So yeah, I think for myself, I'm just going to make sure, mental note to myself, anytime I use the word event, that I'm a little bit more descriptive about what I'm really referring to.
Yeah, because then you like think of like notification systems, and sometimes those are called events too.
Yeah.
You're sending an event to a mobile app that, whatever, they have a new email or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a totally different kind of event now. So yeah, I think that's it. It's just, you got to kind of learn what the different kinds of events are, and what the context is and when you want to use them. And
Yeah, what's the
I,
result? Like, how do you use them, etc.
yeah,
Yeah.
and again with microservices, I suspect you're probably seeing a lot of abuse in events, um, whether that's integration, like sending too much information. That's probably the biggest issue I think out of all of them is just events that are too big. Again, which again is just a sign of your boundaries are probably off.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Loosely Coupled Show. If you did, please subscribe for more on software architecture and design.